Here is a black ink by Platinum Carbon Black.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I have no idea how it took me so long to review this. I use it all the time to do art with. It's great to be able to watercolor over. Perhaps I've missed it because it's so good, I assumed I must have done it. Thanks to viewers for pointing this out. This is a staple among my jars of ink, so yes, I like this a lot. It's a beautiful dark black with no tone variation, no shading, exactly the way black ink should be. And if you aren't using this, you're missing out, especially if you have a need for a permanent ink. With that, I'm going to have to kind of delay how I do some of the writing samples just so you can see them.
The pen for today is a Waterman Graduate. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a beautiful solid black tone with no tone variation at all, no shading, no feather, no spread. It's simply there. And like I said, I'm going to have to delay a little bit so that you get at least a little of the writing. Looking at the medium nib, it's the same tone as the extra fine. There's no feathering, no spread, no shading. Good, beautiful, dark tone the whole way through. Really an excellent ink for students to use. Looking at the stub nib, the same tone as the medium and the extra fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading. Beautiful the whole way through. Really does bring out how nice a stub can help an ink look even better. I mean, this looks good, but just the line variation that you get to really take advantage of with this, it looks amazing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There was approximately 15 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it's the same tone as the Clairfontaine with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading, with just solid black line goodness. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading. We're going to give it a couple seconds here, and I'm just going to mumble about nothing because it's the audio track that I pay attention to during editing. Looking at the stub nib, it's the same tone as it was with the medium, the same tone as on the Clairfontaine with no feathering, no spread, no shading, no problems using this ink whatsoever. Looking at the back of the page, we do get some light ghosting going on with it being as dark as it is, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone that we get on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. We get just great goodness all the way through. It is really an ink that makes you say, I should use black ink more in my writing. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is no shading. Solid performance. Looking at the broad nib, it's the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. We just get to enjoy the line variation that a stub nib gives us and really get to see how good it looks. I wish my handwriting was better for this stuff. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with ghosting. We have nothing that bleeds through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. It's really a very boring review, isn't it, when an ink is this good as a black? There's not a lot you can say. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. There is no feather, there is no spread, there is no shading. It performs perfect. If this was a wrestler, Mr. Perfect would use this. This ink is giving the perfect plex to every pen that it goes into. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the medium, the same tone as Clairefontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get the perfect plex of no shading. Go ahead and put perfect plex down in the comments, because why not? You know, we need a something going on. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Higgins Black. Here is Lamy Black. Here is Omas Black. Here is Schaefer Black. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. You, as a student, using this in your lab notebook, get a full letter grade boost. And if you've earned an A, we'll get you an A in some other class for choosing great inks. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, same as on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. This is what we get. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, We get no shading. We get a beautiful black ink the whole way through. Do you see how I'm running out of how nice it is to say some of this stuff? But hey, at least there's only one more writing sample after this. Looking at the back of the page, we get no ghosting and no bleeding. And I think the ghosting shows a little more on camera than in person. In person, you could easily write back here.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a magenta ink by Monteverde Garnet. Here is a pink ink by J.R.R. Rose Tendresse. Here is a yellow ink by Krishna Danu Udak. Here is a red ink by Califolio Rouge. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get the slightest bit of spread. We get no shading. We have a great performer for 20-pound copy paper. If you have to use this paper, you have to be using this ink with it because it just looks like you're using a wider nib. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as Clairefontaine. We get no feathering. We get light spread. Light spread, it's about up at a medium. Really not bad. This is a great match for this paper. No shading. Again, if you're using 20-pound copy paper because you have to, you really have to use this ink because it is so good. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering. We get very minor spread. When you look at some of the cross lines of it, they're a tiny bit wider, which is the only reason you'd really see it. Stub nibs tend to be harder to spot the spread. It's not. It's doing such a good job. If you really do, I can't recommend this ink enough for copy paper. Looking at the back of the page. Now, I don't think you could write your notes on the back and be okay, but you might be able to. The ghosting is really minimal in what's going on. This ink is not getting deep into the paper. It did not bleed through and touch the page underneath because this is an amazing ink.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Dealer's choice. There. So that was easy. I mean, just need to burn a little time so you can see it writing here, though not in the review. Just as an aside for people who like to use or like to do watercolor, this works very nice in a brush pen. So if you wanted to be able to use a brush pen, to do the line work, this works very well and it holds up so well to water. I think I've given you enough time.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.